Hey, Nihilism Supreme here, the most computer philosophy, internet. Here to talk about racism, probably one of the most controversial yet most talked about ideologies in the world. It's probably been around forever, right? I mean, there's probably always just been hatred for people of other kinds. Barbarians were looked at as lesser, and it was because of their practices and the fact that they just weren't civilized people and did fucked up shit, that they were looked down as lessers that needed to be controlled and and whatnot. All the way into the times of Nazism, which is what really sparked it. I think what's really made racism what it is today. Because before, we had slavery of the black people, and then when the blacks were freed, there was still a lot of hatred towards them and racism. But the term racism, can really be seen coming into existence during the Nazi times. And it was because of this belief of superiority over the other races. While obviously slavery in America was based on a racial superiority complex, they didn't really have a way of describing it. It was just assumed that black people in Africa were brought here to be slaves, and that was the end of the question. And the Nazis came, and they kind of came out with a very similar mindset, but towards every race that isn't the white race. Although the Asians were then seen as somehow a derivative of the white race, which is what made them also along the Aryan Brotherhood. It was kind of like, bullshit artistry coming out of the Nazi propaganda machine to try to show that Asians were alongside whites in the superiority chain. With all of this said, racism then came out of what was called racialism. Racialism was race science. It was this idea that races were distinctly different from each other and could be broken down in a scientific way to show that one race was objectively superior to all the other races. Nowadays, racism is a little bit more broadly used. Racism can really be seen as believing that other races suck purely because they're the other race. If someone to you is bad only because of their race, or that's really the only thing you can think of about this individual that makes them a certain way, then that would be something called racism. There's also sociological breakdown of racism. And the sociological breakdown shows different ways that racism exists, either through cultural influence, like trying to portray certain races in a certain way and portray other races in another way. Or it could be structural, like laws and legislation that subjugates certain races and elevates other races, and these are laws that are targeted towards the races. It could be a more systemic and harder to grasp type of racism. It's something that exists within the hegemony of society that makes society treat a certain race a certain way. And then there's also individualized and personal racism, which is just the everyday racism. When you treat someone else like they're different because of their races, you're racist. It's simple as that. It's treating people a certain way, it's usually negatively, because of their race. And sociology, as well as the regular dictionary definition, agrees with this, that is racism. Racism isn't only a structural systemic force. Only some sociologists actually say that that's the only type of racism. Most sociologists agree that racism is broken down into different types, which includes individualized personal racism, the view that you are better than them because of your color versus their race. Simple as that. You preach intolerance towards these people because of their race. That is racism. So, we're just going to get past that now. If anyone has any objections to that, well, Send me your arguments. Send me your links to the people, and then I'll send you some links to the other people. Stop saying that sociological definition is only structural racism. That sounds like someone who never studied sociology in their life. Racism. What has it contributed towards society? What has it made bad? Well, I can't really say racism has contributed anything towards society. It's a very irrational position, because there's no reason to believe that some beta cuck male who spends all day watching V for Vendetta and posting about race science is somehow superior to Michael Jordan or Shaquille O'Neal. There's no way. Racism doesn't make any sense. Now, there are some people who call themselves race realists, which is a racist that tries to base it off of real facts. Now, not to say that race realism is completely off base. I mean, they do bring up some good points. The issue is, of course, their reaction to these points. Instead of just bringing up things like the homicide rates among black on black crime and white on white crime and whatever, and the fact that black people are more involved with crime, instead of just bringing that up, they kind of conclude that there's some kind of inherent genetic reason for it, and they don't really think that maybe it has anything to do with the structure of society or with economic situations, with the fact that, you know, a lot of black people are born in the ghetto and die in the ghetto. That's it. Like, it's not genetic. You're not genetically born to an economic system. The economic system is your situation. It was given to you, and now you're stuck with it. Some black people make their way out of it, just how some white people make their way out of a fucking trailer park. But the thing is, a lot of white people are just trapped in the trailer park world, and they will always be in the trailer park world. Just how some black people are trapped in the ghetto world, and they will always be there. Unfortunately, there is a disproportion of the amount of black people, and you could possibly say that it has a lot to do with, you know, segregation and slavery and the war on drugs and everything in between. You know, there are reasons for this stuff. It's not genetic. There's no reason to say that it is genetic. But as well, I mean, they could bring up that in other countries, like the UK, that something is similar. Maybe. I don't know. But the reality is that there just seems to be a lot of nuance that race realists kind of just brush off. Not to say that race realists are completely off base. Maybe there are inherent genetic differences between the races. Different amount of melanin for, like, you know, all these people. How do you have, you know, Asian eyes? How do you have more hair on your face and bigger dicks? How do you have the ability to jump much higher than everyone? Like, there might be genetic differences that are inherent within certain races. But to, like, try to suggest that the entire violent structure that is imposed upon us has nothing to do with what might lead people to live a certain life is just lacks a nuance in it, and it really just damages the entire position of race realism in the first place. Like, it's hard to take seriously when they're really trying to say that the only thing that makes us different is genetics, and it has nothing to do with the powers that be or economics or any of that. That, to me, economics is a real science. Sociology is a real science. Is it as good as psychology and biology and physics? No. The thing is, even biology doesn't really find that many differences among the races, and when they do, it's usually one study that isn't replicated at all, or sometimes you may find some things like the fact that black people are more likely to die from high blood pressure due to too much salt consumption. Wow, that totally explains why so many, like, white cops are shooting black people. Racism itself, of course, is beyond race realism. Racism is, of course, the hatred of people of other races, simply because. There's probably plenty of reasons to justify that hatred, but there are no reasons to believe that every individual is subjugated to that, you know, race's stereotype. There's obviously culture behind certain races that you can't deny, but that's different. Culture is a different thing. And the only way to change the culture is to go within it and to try to present things that actually would work. There isn't much of that coming from the racists. The racists just kind of want to erase all rap and hip-hop as if that's going to end crime and end drug use and end promiscuous sex. that all it was rap and hip-hop that was doing that. Just how people were saying the same exact things about rock and roll back in the 60s. And of course, what do we see nowadays? Same people are going after rap and hip-hop, and who the hell knows what they're going after now, because nowadays we still just have everything. I mean, does anyone complain about noise music? Because it's not popular, so they're not worried about it influencing the culture and making the teens get all weird and take peyote and whatever the fuck noise music would be stereotyped of making people do. So, racism, doesn't really have many good things about it at all. The only real good thing I could say about it is that the subset of race realism does have at least a tiny amount of like something that you could pull out of it and use it in a different way. But that's not that. I mean, I don't know if that could really just make anything look positive. Is that like one tiny little thing within that could be pulled out and then actually be salvaged? It doesn't look good for you, racism. Sorry to say. So racism overall, with all of that in mind, I'm going to have to give a strong 1. It's at least consistent usually. It's not even very consistent. If it was more consistent, it would probably be a strong 2. Strong 2, light 3. But it's not very consistent either. A lot of races really just don't know what they're complaining about, or they just come up with weird stereotypes about other groups of people that I find very offensive just to have to hear about these really weird stereotypes that you came up with that don't make any sense at all. It's almost like you never met someone of this other race. Whatever.